And once you do all of this, it looks something like this. So when you scroll to the section, it animates like so. So now let's build this intersection observer class from scratch ourselves. Bottom to middle, and welcome back to the series where we're studying for senior front-end engineering interview questions. Today we're building an intersection observer from scratch. In the previous video, I've demoed exactly what an intersection observer is and how it works, but let's take another quick look at it and build it from scratch ourselves. So we have created 3 sections here: section 1, section 2, and section 3. Each section is just underneath each other, and each section has its own unique background color, like so. And we've provided a position relative to each section. And then the p tags that are contained within each section is with a position absolute. And that's just so we can position it in the very center of each of the sections using transform translate -50%, -50%. We also are setting the top by default to 90% instead of 50%. So it's initially going to show up somewhere down here. And opacity to 0, and transition 1 second all, meaning that when we apply a class to this, such as show, it's going to animate by providing the opacity to 1, and also top position is just going to animate it to the center of the screen. And then in terms of JavaScript, the intersection observer API looks like so, where we find an element or a list of elements that we want to use the intersection observer API for. We iterate through them, and then we do observer.observe element. Then we define our observer here using new intersection observer, which returns a list of entries. We iterate through the entries, and we check if the entry is intersecting. If it is, then we do entry.target.classlist.add show if it's intersecting, and if it's not, we remove that show from the class list from the entry.target. And once you do all of this, it looks something like this. So when you scroll to the section, it animates like so. So now let's build this intersection observer class from scratch ourselves. So I'm going to rename this to call it my intersection observer. And everything else we can just keep as is. So if I run this, we should get an error because intersection observer does not exist. So let's build this class out ourselves. So we'll do class my intersection observer, which takes in a constructor like so. And this intersection observer class also has an observe method. So let's define that here, which takes in an element. Now, remember the constructor eventually returns this callback function that returns a list of entries. So let's first keep track of this entries class variable. So let's call it this.entries equals to an empty list by default. And then in the observe method, what we'll do is we'll say this.entries.push, and then let's open an object in here, and let's specify the element just to be the element itself. And in fact, we can just use the short form where we don't have to do the colon. So element itself. Then we want to specify if it's intersecting or not. So we'll say is intersecting, which is false by default. Then let's specify the target itself. So target is also element. And in fact, I don't actually think we need element here if we're specifying target, because it looks like entry target is one of the class properties it needs. So let's just use target to specify the element itself. Next, we want to get the top offset of wherever this particular section is on relative to the DOM itself. So let's call it top offset. And how we get that is we do element, and then element has a method inside called get bounding client rect and then top. So what this does is it provides us the top value for this element relative to the top of the page itself, not the parent div. And then we want to do the same thing for the bottom offset too. Bottom offset, and then it'll just do bottom here. And that's pretty much it. That's what we need for our observe method. Now let's build our constructor itself. So in our constructor, what we also need is we want to keep track of the scroll event itself. So we'll do here window dot add. event listener, and we'll watch for the scroll event. And then we'll just call this function called this.handle scroll, like so. And let's define this handle scroll function. So we'll say this.handle scroll is an arrow function, like so. Now, inside of here, what we want to check is if entries has a length, then we do stuff. If entries doesn't have any length, then we don't want to do anything, because this handle scroll function is expensive. Basically, every time you're scrolling on the screen, this is going to be called, and we want to avoid calls to this as much as possible. So let's just put a guard check here. So we'll say if this.entries, this.entries.length. So as long as it does not have a length, we just return it. So we don't want to do any further processing here, right? So now what we can do is if it does have entries, then let's iterate through it. So we'll say this.entries for each entry and the index. Let's grab the index as well. So now that we have the entry and the index itself, so now we want to check if this particular entry is actually being intersected on the page, and we'll define a helper function for that. But eventually it'll be called and it'll look something like this. It'll be like this dot is intersecting, and then we'll provide the entry itself, and this will return a boolean, true false, whether or not that particular element is being intersected on the page. So let's build this out. So we'll just build it right above it. So we'll say this dot is intersecting is equal to an arrow function, which takes in one argument, which is just the entry itself. And in here, what we want to do is we want to first keep track of exactly where we're scrolling on the page itself, right? So we'll say const scroll top position is equal to window dot scroll y, and then we'll say const window height, which is equal to window dot inner height. And lastly, we want to understand the bottom scroll position of where we're currently at. So we'll say const window bottom scroll position, which is scroll top position plus window height. Let's actually go ahead and do a console.log of all of this just to see what we are printing. And I'm just gonna go ahead in our for loop. I'm just gonna print this out directly like so. Comment this out for now just so we can see what everything is happening. And let's do it relative to the elements themselves. So let's do our first console.log. So let's do console.log scroll top position like so. And then let's also console.log the entry, console.log entry.top, which is entry.top offset. And then scroll top position is just scroll top position. And then let's also console.log window bottom scroll position like so. And window.height doesn't matter much because this is just the height of whatever this is here. But basically what we're doing, and before I print this out, window.scrollY by default is going to print 0 because we're at the very top of the scroll window. So as we start scrolling, window.scrollY will start incrementing. But what we want to end up determining is the scroll bottom position, right? Because when a section comes, we know the top position of the section, but we want to immediately fire an event when it comes into view. So that would mean we want to understand when the bottom position intersects with the top position of the section itself. So let's run this. We might get some errors too, hopefully not. Let's see what we get. Cannot access my intersection observer before it's initialized. So it looks like we need to call this at the bottom. Cool, we're not getting any errors, so let's run this. Yes, so let's see what we get. Now we're getting a bunch of logs because we're doing a for loop within a window.scroll function, which is not very good. But as you can see, the scroll top position, let's go to the very top. By default, it starts off around 0. But the scroll bottom position of the window is, again, scroll top plus the height is this guy. Now the entry top, this is the first entry. It's saying that the entry top position is going to be 188 pixels. So that means that if this is greater than the window bottom position, then we should add a class to it because it is intersecting. It's already available. So let's write this out. So we'll say if the window bottom scroll position, if ever greater than the entry dot scroll, what's it called? Offset top? Top offset. You know what? Let's just simplify this. Let's just call it top. It's a bit easier to remember. Entry dot top. So if window dot scroll bottom position is ever greater than entry dot top, then we're going to return true. And in fact, because this is just returning a Boolean, this function, we can just return this here. Return this guy, right? And now let's comment our conditional back in, like so. And what we will say here is if this is ever true, if we're intersecting, then we want to say entry dot target dot add class list dot add show. Otherwise, we want to remove it like so. And that way it'll add and remove the class based off of if it's intersecting. So let's run this. So let's inspect this now. And remember, we're attaching that class to the P tag itself. So let's open these guys up. So right now we're going to be just appending the add class, but we're going to need to make some improvements. So if I scroll here, you see show is added to section 1. And then if I scroll down, show is added to section 2, but notice it's now removed from section 1. So we also need to keep track if that specific section is out of the screen. And then let's go to section 3 and show is shown there again. So if I scroll back up, now it's removed because of that offset, and the second one's going to be removed. So let's fix the issue of the top ones not being removed. So here we're checking if the window.bottom scroll position is ever greater than entry.top, but we also want to check and the scroll top position, if this is ever less than the entry top bottom, this will also take care of the case of keeping track of the scroll top position being less than the entry dot bottom. So let's run this. Let's inspect it. So now let's open these guys once. So if I scroll, so we get show on section 1, removes from section 1 now because section 2 is visible. And then now we show section 3 and remove from section 2. Now, I want to show some improvements we can make here. So although we're able to add and remove the show class, this myIntersectionObserver now is very specific to this feature that we're adding. So let's make it a little bit more generic. So remember, the constructor here returns a callback function, right? So we'll call it callback function. Because remember, if you look at down here, it returns this like function, which returns a list of entries, right? So let's call the callback function at the very end of our handle scroll. So we'll call it right here. And inside our callback function, we just want to return this.entries, like so. And then in here, instead of doing any specific logic here, all we need to do here is we want to update the entries list to let us know whether or not it is intersecting or not. So we can do that by doing this.entries index, because we already know the index of where we're currently at now, dot is intersecting equals to this dot is intersecting entry, like so. So that will take care of whether or not that particular entry is being intersected. And then we're just calling the callback function with this dot entries. So let's run this again. So now when I run this, notice everything is still working because now our intersection observer entries is actually being returned here. And then our previous logic is still working. So now let's put a console.log here to make things a little bit more performant. So if I do a console.log within the loop of entries, let's actually see how many times this is called. So it's actually called so many times to the point where we can't even keep track of it. In fact, if you notice, it's still being called here. This is still being incremented because let's think about what it's doing. This returns us a callback function that returned us a list of entries, and then we're iterating through the entries and we're doing other work. But this is happening on every single time we are scrolling for every single pixel. So obviously this is very heavy and we can make some drastic improvements to this. So let's make this a little bit more performant. So the biggest thing is we don't want to actually call callback function every single time we scroll. So let's cut this out for now. And we don't even want to apply this is intersecting function unless the value of intersecting has actually changed. So let's do a conditional here. So if this dot is intersecting for that particular index is false, right? So we'll say if this is false and this dot intersecting for that particular entry is true, right? Then we want to update the value. So we'll say this dot intersecting equals to true, right? Because now it's only going to apply once. And then let's do an else if, and we'll just copy the exact statement, but just reverse it. So let's get rid of the exclamation point here and let's add an exclamation point here. So if this is ever true, then we'll say this dot entries for that particular index dot intersecting is false. Otherwise, we don't really need to do anything else. The last thing we really just want to do here is we want to call our callback. So we'll say callback function, and then we just want to call this dot entries like so. And let's also do that callback function in the other line too. And other than that, we are pretty much good to go. So let's try running this. And we already have a console.log down here. So let's see what this returns. In fact, I'm just going to do a console.log entry.isIntersecting. So now when I scroll, notice that we don't get those extra calls. It doesn't break our browser. It's all working now much better, much more performant. We only return a value if that value has changed, just like so. Now there's one other additional improvement we can make here. So I'm going to save this and I'm going to refresh the page and watch what happens when I first refresh it. So when you first load the page, notice how everything is blank. This is because on the constructor, we are only handling the window.add event listener scroll. This does not take into account page load. On page load, we also want to check all these intersecting functions. So the simplest thing we can do here is on the observe method itself, we can just call this.handleScroll. And this will handle the initial rendering of the page. So if I run this, now the first rendering works fine. If I scroll, second works fine, third, if I scroll, and then if I scroll back up, it's all working as expected. And we can even look at the logs down here. In fact, I'll put an index here. So entry and index. And then we're already console.log entry.isIntersecting. Let's also console.log the index itself that we are referencing. So by default, we're at true at 0, which is great. Now we're at section 2. Let's see. So section 0 is false, expected. Section 2 is true. Section 3 is false. And the same thing in the last one. Now the last section is true and the rest are false. And this applies when you go back up. So that's how you build an intersection observer class from scratch. If you guys found this video helpful, consider subscribing and pressing the like button below. And with that, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thanks, bye.